Adam Masters. How does your position up the bridge affect you in the Sea Org? I believe I heard you mention that the Sea Org don't really recruit people already high up on the bridge on the OT levels, probably because it's better for the church that they are paying money for their courses rather than earning $50 a week. You also mentioned that when you were staff and in the Sea Org, even though all your courses in auditing were free, you never had time to do them. However, some Sea Org members must get to OT. They are the ones who deliver the OT levels at the advanced orgs, flag, and on the free winds, so surely they must be OT themselves. Also, to work in quote-unquote sensitive areas like OSA and RTC, I expect they would be well up the bridge. Are they kids of rich public who put their children through the OT levels at a young age? Are they selected based on their dedication or knowledge of the tech or something else? It seems some people join the Sea Org and slave away at some lowly post for decades, while others will hotshot to the top to be personal envoys of Miscavige until he throws them in the hole. How does this all work? Hey, Adam, thank you for this question. And I understand why it can seem confusing or even contradictory trying to figure this whole thing out, because it is a bit of a mess. And it is very, very arbitrary as to how people move up the bridge in the Sea Org or in Scientology staff. Most staff end up paying, for their OT levels and stuff and just do it that way. But Sea Org don't. And so it's not actually, I took this up because I wanted to clear up a couple things that I might have said that could have been confusing or misleading, completely not purposefully, just it's a little hard to explain sometimes. So you said, so first off, the thing about recruiting people into the Sea Org who are already on the OT levels or are already reached the state of OT, that does happen. I didn't mean to imply that we never went after OTs. We did all the time. Problem in trying to get an OT into the Sea Org is they're usually in massive amounts of debt. And they have a house and they have kids and mortgages and things. And so you have to deal with all that before you can kind of lift them out of their life and put them in the Sea Org. You can't have any ties to the outside world as a Sea Org member. So you can't own a house or, have big debts that you have to keep servicing and things like that. So that's generally why we weren't going after the OTs. And there is, of course, the matter that for the rich OTs, for the whales, the people who are really contributing money, you want them to keep paying. So yeah, that is a factor as well, that, their income stream is more valuable to us than their work as a Sea Org member. But that's really mostly a matter of the logistics of the problem, more so than we didn't want them in the Sea Org. We actually did. We wanted everybody in the Sea Org. Anybody we could get, we were going to go after. And anybody that we could deal with their problems and logistics, well, let's do it. This was a series of steps you would have to do to arrive in the Sea Org. If you couldn't come right away, would be called a project prepare. And it was the project to prepare you to come into the Sea Org, the steps you need to take in order to do that. And so finishing actions, paying debts, having your kids move out of the house, etc., might be part of a project prepare for somebody at that level. That takes time. It takes a lot of dedication and work and check back and working with them and having to reclose them to do it, because they would run into life problems and go, screw it, the Sea Org just isn't going to happen. Then you have to go re-recruit them. Recruiters aren't really allowed a lot of leeway and time to be working long term on recruitment prospects who are going to take a long time to arrive. They're more interested in the immediate right now, who can we get? Because if you don't have somebody recruited this week, you're coming in with a big zero, goose eggs, and that's unacceptable statistically. So you got to kind of balance, who you're going after and why. And this is one of the main reasons why most Sea Org recruits are young kids, right out of school, still in school, just pick them up and get them out of there, or recently graduated, second generation, because that's there's the least amount of work you'd have to do with them to get them in. They have no obligations, no debts, no real life burden, Okay, so that's kind of the bigger picture of Sea Org recruitment: is get anybody you can, but you have to get them now, now, now. And yes, sometimes bigger, beefier, more qualified kind of people were recruited, but like I said, they would take time and they would be more of an almost a special recruitment project in and of themselves. And generally, that sort of thing was done for OTs or for executive caliber, management caliber, somebody that Miscavige maybe had a personal interest in, or somebody at Gold, like there's, some kind of cine talent or photographic or, video talent or something, right? Those might be the kind of people we're going to invest a little bit more time in, because it's going to be more cost effective than having to train a new Sea Org member from the bottom up, doesn't know anything about that skill set. So that might be the kind of thing you would see more time and more resources invested in. And that was not very common. Most of the time, the Sea Org recruiters were working on the immediate get it now sort of thing. Okay, now as far as you mentioned, yeah, some people have to get to OT. That's true. And sometimes there is there is what's called the Technical Training Corps, which is a full-time job of training to do an auditor job or a supervisor job, a technical job. There's also the Administrative Training Corps, which is where you send staff or Sea Org, who are going to be training to be executives or management personnel, right? Administrative personnel. So you have a TTC and you have an ATC, and these two units are basic, and it exists in any org. And the staff who are going to go off for full-time training for specialized positions are going to be transferred into that unit. And then they'll do that training, and then they'll get back on their job. Well, if that job includes being an OT auditor and you're not OT, then part of your TTC program is going to be getting your OT levels. And that happens from time to time, very rarely. Because what we were really looking for were people who are already OT that we could plug in there, because you don't want to wait for some schmuck to get, months to get through his OT levels so that he can then do the job you want him to do. You want him to do the job now. So we tended to look for people who were already OT and transfer them into the TTC so they could fill that future OT auditor slot, or whatever slot it was we had them, slotted for. Okay. And there were only so many OTs in the Sea Org, people who had somehow gotten on the OT levels, in the 70s even, or the 80s. I mean, there were some old folks around who had done the OT levels a long time ago. Still OT. So we would try to transfer them around. And it was actually sometimes easier to replace a high-powered executive who was OT with a non-OT, because it's not required that you be OT in order to be an executive in any level of Scientology. So we would try to find some Joe Schmo who wasn't OT who could replace this guy. And we even replaced, and I saw other people replace senior executives of Scientology churches who were OT, so they could become auditors, so they could become OT auditors. This was in the Sea Org. So you might have somebody who was the deputy captain, or who was just below that level on the organizing board, and we're taking them to become an auditor. We're actually demoting them way down the chain of command to become an OT auditor just because they're OTs, and we don't have time to make a new OT. We'll just take him. So that's kind of the trade-off of that, is OTs are, they're valuable, and we would use them and utilize them as best we could. And you had to have OTs to be an OT auditor. There's no way around that. You cannot be non-OT and deliver the OT levels to people. So those are one of the few positions where it's absolutely required. And I wanted to take this up because you mentioned that you thought sensitive areas like OSA and RTC might be manned by OTs. They're not. Most people in OSA and RTC are not OTs. Some are, and I think the people in charge are, but a lot of the staff are not. And some of them aren't even clear. Not a requirement. So, what is a requirement is if you're going to be dealing with any of the stuff where OT material might possibly be coming across your desk, then there might be an issue. But even then, most of the time, you would be sending those documents, or that, like if somebody had to review Leah's show, and there's going to be information about the OT levels on the show. Well, they'll get an OT to watch the show and give them a report on what came up. And the report won't have in it the actual OT information. It'll just say, yeah, they shared, they were spewing confidential OT information, or they just were saying, I don't know how they communicate about that in OSA, actually. I have no idea if they lie to each other about it or if they're straight up about it. But somebody who is OT would be required to watch it. The non-OT wouldn't, and the non-OT would then, like I said, get reports or whatever and deal with that. So that's kind of how I have seen that work. I just know for a fact that a bunch of people in OSA and RTC are not OTs. However, the closer you get to the top, it tends to go in that direction. And either that's because they're manning those command posts with veteran Sea Org members who've been around for so long that somehow over all those years they managed to get themselves up the OT levels. Or, as I mentioned earlier, they were already gotten to OT back when it was a lot easier to do it, back in the 70s and 80s. Or they're just not OT in the first place. Okay. As far as your question about, are they recruiting the kids of rich public who put their kids through the OT levels at a young age? Sometimes, yeah, that actually has happened. I've seen that. There were second-gen Scientologists who were recruited from wealthy families. I'm thinking about the Feshbacks, for example. A couple other families where kids were recruited into the Sea Org who had done the OT levels already, right? Or who were already on them. So, yeah, so that does happen. And those people do tend to be the youngest and hottest and brightest and get, flown up to the top. That's how Jessica Feshback ended up in Miscavige's inner circle before she got the boot for screwing up with Tommy Davis. Okay, so mainly you asked, are they selected based on their dedication or knowledge of the tech or something else? Mainly loyalty tests and dedication in terms of people going into sensitive areas. More so, that's more of a factor than their case level, than their OT level. Okay, and at the end, you surmised it correctly that some people join the Sea Org and slave away at lower posts for decades, and others get shot up to the top. You are absolutely right about that. That does happen. And the exact opposite happens too. It's a wild, weird, crazy place. The Sea Org is extremely chaotic, and the orders make it worse because of the personnel demands and the transfers and stuff. And actually, just so you guys know, Cyprian and I will be doing a future podcast in the next couple of weeks on this exact thing about how personnel and personnel transfers are done. And I'm going to go into a whole podcast about it because there's a lot to say about how insanely chaotic it is. However bad you think corporate America is with personnel and human resources, and it's pretty bad, they ain't got nothing on Scientology. So I think you guys will look forward to, we'll be happy to hear about that whole thing when I break that all down. That'll come in a couple weeks. Thanks for asking about this, Adam.